I don't want to talk about this map, guys. This is probably the hardest map that I have ever done in LTC, and to be quite honest, trying to get through it broke me in new and exciting ways. But I've got to do it eventually, and I've been putting it off for too long. So let's get started on Chapter 9's main mission. The first thing I'm going to do is head out and hire Faye. I need her, or more accurately, I need Faramir for the next map. And hiring her now and then rehiring her costs exactly the same amount as just hiring her in the next map, while giving her twice as much happiness. So I'm going to go with that plan. If you'll recall the last main mission, I talked a little bit about Burrows, the ballistician, and he has now permanently joined my army, but in order for him to have any equipment, I need to select to pay in this little cutscene choice, and that pays for his ballista and bolts. I'm not sure whether choosing don't pay still lets you get him just without his equipment or not, but obviously I didn't intend to take the chance. So let's talk a bit about the civilian requests for this chapter. There are, as usual, 3 of them, and the first one involves us getting some Imperial equipment. Now there was one like this all the way back in Chapter 4 when we got Laurentia, and I didn't do it then, and I don't intend to do this one because it simply relies too much on capturing, and that's just extra RNG that I don't want to put up with at all. The second of the civilian requests for this map involves Reese going and talking to a specific enemy unit who is not identifiable just by looking, and that's obviously not going to work out because Reese needs to be heading directly for the objective in this map. There's absolutely no time for him to deviate from that. So that just leaves one civilian request that's feasible for me to complete, and this involves deploying Adel and sending him to a specific house on the map. So when I was doing my initial test runs, I decided to try and clear the map and see what the reward for this was, and then I failed to clear the map and continued to fail to clear the map repeatedly. So it took a really long time before I managed to find out what the reward was, and it turned out that it was a Soma, which is something that I've been waiting for a very long time. By that point, I already had half the map recorded with Adel deployed and my units going for the civilian request, but finding out that the reward was the Soma meant that I now had no reason to go back and restart again for the extra reliability that I could have pulled out by not going for it and instead using that area of the map for other things. But I will explain that in a little more detail later on. In addition to these, there were hints about something happening with Arthur if I deployed him on this map and did something with him, not specified, but I decided not to bother investigating that because deploying one nearly useless unit was already comfortably bad enough. My preparations for this map are pretty much the usual mix of trading random items around. In particular, there's the repair stone, which is going on Sherpa, because his Brim Ranger is nearly broken, and it's a really good weapon, so I kind of want it around, and it's very important in the upcoming clear. Something else that's interesting is that some of the food I fed my units claims to raise critical rate. However, this appears to be wrong, as they don't have any base crit in the actual map, and based on what they actually fight, looking at critical rates from the enemy, it actually appears to be increasing their critical dodge rate, which isn't quite as useful. Something else to note at the end of all this is that I am desperately short on cash, so I'm selling a nearly broken Aspis because it's more valuable to me as money than one single possible block for Ruby. Luckily, I don't need to make any more decisions on what to sell just yet. That'll have to wait until next chapter. So now let's have a talk about the map itself. The shortest route for Reese to reach the objective, which is a green unit locked in a cell up at the top of the map, is for him to cross over a bridge and then bust through a couple of the 100 HP gates that we love so much. And as usual, the controls to lower the bridge are on the opposite side of the water to us, which means someone needs to get up there who can cross water. And Axel obviously does not have the movement to do this in time to lower it for Reese, so it's Laurentia who needs to be heading up there. But sitting on top of the gate controls is the first major obstacle of the map. This is an enemy Imperial heavy gunner who has a Chukonu as well as the counter skill and 4 sleep arrows. And this is just the nastiest combination of things imaginable. My original plan was to have Laurentia go up there and one-hit KO him, and I didn't realize at first that he had counter, and so I thought I would have a couple of shots at that. However, he does have counter, so if Laurentia tries that, she gets immediately whacked with a sleep arrow, falls asleep, and the run is over because then Axel is the only awake unit who's capable of getting up there. And really I should have realized sooner that this was a no-go, because in order to one-hit KO him, Laurentia needs to get a high roll critical hit with the killer spear, which is just too many unreliable things happening all at once. And so this is the reason why I pulled out Faramir to help, because he has 5 movement, and because he has bows, he is able to attack the crossbow guy with 2 range, and thus avoid a counterattack from the Chukonu. So with the main group laid out, let's talk for a moment about Adel's group. They are heading east to get to the house that he needs to visit, and accompanying him are Ward, who's obviously the main combat unit over there, as well as Ruby and Silvus, who are there trying to pick up as much experience as they can. This group is more or less just sufficient for what they need to do. Now, right at the start of the map, Volo moved into range of some enemies in the island that Reese and Co have to cross, and these enemies are Lance Knights. I believe this is the first instance of enemy Lance users that I have encountered in this run, so we'll talk about that for a bit. Like spears, lances increase in damage if their user moves before initiating combat, but most spears only give 1 extra damage per space moved, while lances tend to give 2 or more, and that makes them extremely scary and perfectly capable of one-hit KOing some of my more fragile units. Because of this, it's pretty crucial that I deal with this enemy squad, because if I leave them alive, they will be a thorn in my rear as they come in with extremely high damaging attacks on my units that are trying to push forwards. There is another group of Lance Knights on the end of a bridge on the other side of the map, and these are a mini-boss squad. All of them have names, and they have extremely powerful lances that make them very scary opponents. And we're going to have to deal with them in one way or another as well, and you'll see how that turns out. Because of these guys existing, Adel and his group have to hold back a bit and not rush directly for the house. If they were to get too close to the bridge, then the mini-boss squad would come charging towards them rather than over towards my main group, and Adel and his friends do not remotely have the capacity to deal with that. Instead, the goal with this group is to just kind of chill and try and make sure Ward doesn't take too many kills, because this will allow Silvus and Ruby to get them instead. Ruby doesn't necessarily need the experience points from kills per se, but what she does need is equipment experience, which is extremely slow to grow just from combat, I have found. So giving her a few more levels is going to be the fastest way for her to reach 20 in her swords and spears. Sylphus, on the other hand, definitely needs the kills for experience, because while she is closing in on level 10, she still has a bit over a level to go, and I'm really hoping to get her to level 10 by the end of this chapter, so that I can permanently recruit her and not have to worry about paying money for her anymore. Back with the main squad, Laurentia took up a very specific position this turn. This is going to allow her to canto to a specific place after taking her action next turn, and that's crucial to making sure Reese can continue his advance towards the goal. Meanwhile, I deployed Dean on this map, and he is very close to his permanent recruitment target of 60 kills over the course of the game. He is quite effective against these enemy Lance Knights, and he's actually going to get 2 kills here over the course of this map. And the reason I say he's quite effective is that he's still holding on to the war pick that I gave him a couple of maps ago, and this allows him to get guaranteed damage without the Lance Knights being able to activate their shields against him. Now, one important aspect of Lances that I didn't mention before is that they are unable to counterattack, and they also deny their target from counterattacking, but that's not important. The first part is important because it means that Dean is not able to use his desperation skill against them to get a guaranteed follow-up attack. This also prevents Volo from deathmatching them, and is part of the reason why these Lance Knights are so bulky effectively. But Dean is not going to be going with the main group after this, so he has the free actions to wait around and make sure that the Lance Knights die and don't follow us. This is the turn on which Faramir needs to start chipping down the enemy gunner on the bridge controls, but he is going to be delaying doing that because there is an enemy raised priest within the castle. You might be able to see him at some points, and he has a dark mend and is quite willing to use it to heal off Faramir's damage. So once the raised priest takes his turn, Faramir will go in and attack, and then he will attack again at the very start of the subsequent turn to completely deny that guy an opportunity to heal his comrade. Note that Faramir is the only archer who could possibly do this duty, because Christine would be mounted and thus unable to go onto the cliff tile, and she'd also be more impeded by the shoals and the forest, while Sylphus couldn't do it because Faramir just has the 1 extra movement from celerity, and he needs that to get to the attacking point on time. I gave Faramir the killer arrows from Sylphus for this map. He doesn't strictly need them in order to kill this enemy, because he cleanly 2-hit KOs with his steel arrows, but the killer arrows having a chance of a critical hit do add a little bit of reliability to the strategy later on, where there are some enemies that I need to kill or remove in short order. Sherpa breaks Brim Ranger at this point. I chose to do this in order to put bigger chip damage on this Lance Knight than the Longsword would have achieved, and I intend to repair Brim Ranger anyway, since Sherpa has a free turn to do that next turn, so there's no harm in completely breaking it at this point. And this next little stretch, I have to admit, is me screwing up repeatedly. Firstly, Ruby stole a kill that should probably have gone to Sylphus here, because Sylphus needs the kills, as I've mentioned before. And then I send Sylphus down in order to start fighting with the archers that are sitting on top of the cliffs. And this turns out to be an extremely bad idea, because the RNG is not my friend at this moment, and Sylphus gets badly hurt from that round of combat. So to be completely safe, I send Ward down and have him guard Sylphus, just to make absolutely sure that she stays alive through the next turn and doesn't ruin this take. Faramir now moves to eliminate the bridge guard, which is good riddance because I really hate that guy. he was such a pain in the ass during recording, and I wish him a slow, painful death wherever he ends up. And this leaves Laurentia free to move in and lower the bridge for everyone to start moving in. And this is why it was important for Laurentia to not canto too far. The reason for her specific positioning I mentioned earlier was to maximize the damage that she dealt to the door before cantoing down to a cliff, which she can dismount on. Now, you will have noticed that Axel is deployed, despite the fact that I dismissed him as a candidate for crossing the water earlier. That's because he is finally going to be permanently recruited on this map, which I think is about time because he's made some pretty substantial contributions to the LDC so far. He is going to enter that house on the island that everyone's moving up in a moment, and he's going to have to fight an extended combat in there. Now, the Race Priest does not only have a Dark Mend, he also has an offensive weapon. I don't remember which one, I'm sorry, but he is sometimes capable of attacking Laurentia and or Reese through the wall on this turn, and so I delay Reese's movement once again until the Race Priest goes in order to prevent him from being targeted in this way. So now let's turn our attention back to Adel's group. They've already dealt with one annoying enemy, but there are two more who are waiting in the wings to move in and be annoying. One of these is a Lance Knight who can one-hit KO Adel and is extremely mobile, so that's someone we have to really be careful about dealing with. And there is also another gunner with another Chukonu, which is also a terrifying prospect for any of my units. In fact, even Ward is capable of being killed by this guy. This is largely because my Ward has his shield nearly broken, and it's not normally a problem, but it's something I have seen happen, and I think this is the first time I have ever seen Ward die, so that's notable if nothing else. There is one Lance Knight still alive of the original group, but he is not being targeted by any of my main combat units. They're heading north, and as I mentioned before, Dean is going to be hanging back to deal with him, along with Axel, who is now in combat with his old friend Doros. He manages to completely fail to kill Doros, but that's actually okay. The events leading to Axel's permanent recruitment play out the same regardless, which is pretty neat. This is probably the one relaxed part of this map. Now, it's important to note that Sherpa is in a specific position, exactly 4 spaces from the gate on this turn, and that's going to allow him to move in to break it on the subsequent turn. Because of this, Clifford gets pushed back 1 space, but the movement requirements in these next few turns are actually also kind of relaxed, which is good because they coincide with some of the least reliable combat in the entire clear. So we're going to get into those horrible turns just now. But firstly, we need to make sure that Adel's group is okay, and in order to do that, I'm going to do some messing around with silvers, because believe it or not, I finally found a use for the broadhead arrows. The Lance Knight down there really wants to go for Adel on this turn, but Silvis's hide skill allows her to use a vulnerary to heal herself up, while also getting in an attack against the Lance Knight using the broadhead arrows. And this kills his horse, meaning that he is a complete non-threat for the remainder of the map. This is because of the last quirk of Lancers, which is that they cannot be used unless the user is mounted. Interestingly enough, I did also manage to kill an enemy horse without using a horse-slaying weapon on this map, which I didn't realize was possible, but it turns out it is. Annoyingly, Ruby ended up whiffing her hit in this particular attempt, and this means that Adel has to move in and take the kill, so that Ward can subsequently start chipping down the Chukonu guy. This led to Adel getting his first ever level, and it turned out to be pretty crap, which is kind of to be expected because Adel is kind of crap at this point in the game. The reason why I focused first on Adel's group on this turn is so that I can delay having Sherpa break down the gate, because this means that I can wait for the 4 enemies waiting just inside the gate to expend their turns so that I don't have to deal with extra combat problems from them until the subsequent turn. Meanwhile, the squad of enemies, including the 4 Lance Knight mid-bosses, has started moving towards my main group, setting up an eastern flank here. And one of the enemies there is apparently a super armor knight, and this is a Gigas knight. So he has a Gigas axe, which is an axe that grants its user plus 20 defense, and that means that this Gigas knight has something like 37 defense, which means none of my units are remotely capable of killing him, and this actually turns out to be a good thing, which I'll get to in a moment. For now, we need to talk about what's happening, as Sherpa has finally broken down the gate, and Reese has moved in. He is moving 1 space less than his full movement here, which is actually a difference from how I had been playing it prior to this attempt. So clearly this was a good change because this attempt turned out to be successful. And I suspect this is because it means it's less easy for the enemies to block me in here. Clifford 1 round KOs the enemy that he faces as long as he doesn't get shield blocked twice or miss, so that's very reliable. And Reese was also quite reliable at 1 rounding the crossbow guy that he dealt with. But Reese still has to face 2 more enemies on this turn, one of whom is an enemy knight with a knight sword. And that means that Reese is not guaranteed to get damage against this guy, and he takes more potential hits than is entirely comfortable. Though fortunately on this particular clear, he manages to get in both 1 hit and a shield block, so he only ends up taking 3 damage from that combat. The other enemy that Reese had to fight there has a really interesting weapon called a Doru, which raises defense when more than 1 of them are together, but fortunately I don't have to deal with that particular effect because the 2 Doru users don't get close to each other. At the start of turn 6, Volu moves into a very scary choke point that he is going to be holding for the remainder of this map. And we'll come back to why it's so scary, but for now we need to talk about Sophie, who is currently attacking Reese. Sophie has a very powerful bow called Pascagnon, which is a devil weapon. So it's very powerful, and usually it is comfortably able to kill Reese, but he managed to take pretty minimal damage from his combat on this particular attempt, so with a shield bash he was able to live without making use of Gram's miracle charm effect, which is pretty handy. Sophie's backfire rate is also 20%, so there's a decent chance that she won't deal damage at all, with Gram's effect being a final resort. Now, Sophie is kind of Esteban's love interest, and fighting her is important for permanently recruiting him, but you do not actually have to kill her for that. You just want to because it's terrifying having her moving around and attacking. Laurentia moves in and crits the Raised Priest at this point, which is extremely nice because otherwise he has a bad habit of using his Dark Mint to heal up Sophie, who is extremely difficult to kill, or using his offensive magic to finish off any of my units, which have pretty much no magical resilience at all. So that critical hit from Laurentia was really very helpful. Clifford is now free to move up to the second 100 HP gate and start the task of breaking it down using the Knight Sword. This is why he was traded the fresh Knight Sword from Ward, leaving Ward with the old and worn out one, because Clifford really needs it. It's very lucky here that Reese managed to get a dodge and a critical against the Knight Sword enemy, because otherwise he was definitely going to waste his Gram, which is not ideal. The level up he gets from here is just a bonus. He's going to move up and use his Vulnerary in order to heal that damage off shortly. Now, Sophie, as you can see, has some annoying defensive skills. Despite Faramir using his Cutlass Plus, he doesn't have crit rate because she has the Fortune skill. And in addition to that, she also has Miracle, which in this game forces any fatal blow to be re-rolled with 10 less hit, and that's very irritating. Basically, in order to finish her off, I effectively have to hit her twice in a row. Now, the Gigas Knight has moved in to attack Volo, and that led to the demise of his Miracle Charm, but the Gigas Knight does not have Canto, and that means that Volo is now in a nearly perfect choke point. The only things he has to worry about now are the infantry units, who can walk around on the cliffs to get to him, and the enemies with 2 range, but he does not have to deal with the enemy Lance Knight boss squad. And this choke point is absolutely critical to the success of my remaining turns, because having that boss squad running around and attacking my units from behind was definitely a recipe for absolute disaster, and this was the best way I found to hold them up. Volo is pretty uniquely suited to this, because there is a good chance that he does have to fight all of the enemy Lance Knights on this first turn before the Gigas Knight moves, because they will often attack in sequence if he dodges one or more of them. Luckily, I got the Gigas Knight quite early in this clear. A large part of why this works is that the Gigas Knight is basically invincible to Volo's attacks, and to that end I really should have switched away from the killing edge that he was holding, but it turns out alright in the end. Volo was mostly chosen for this role because he has pretty much the highest void of any of my infantry units, and this was also why he got the meal that he did at the start of this map. Now, it may look like Rhys is wasting a large chunk of his movement on this turn, but he actually isn't, because the innermost part of this fort is in fact a building, and he has to dismount in order to go inside. So, because you'd have to dismount at the start of the turn, this isn't wasting any movement because he would have just gotten up to it and not been able to proceed inside anyway. I take out Sophie here using Sherpa. He is the most reliable option for it because he has the highest accuracy against her, as well as having 3 attempts thanks to Brim Ranger, and that deals with her, so we don't have to deal with Pascanion anymore. The choice to do it this way round does mean that Volo has to dodge the Gigas Knight on this turn, but again, he's pretty reliable at doing that. Now, the reason why I bought him a concoction is because from full health, he is 2-hit KO'd by the Gigas Knight, even through a vulnerary. So in order for him to survive that, he needs to heal back to full. And so he has a vulnerary and a concoction to make sure that he is never in a position to die in 2 attacks. I brought Axel up in the hopes that he might be able to help out a little bit, but it really didn't turn out that way, and both he and Laurentia need to get out of there because they've both been chipped down. So Axel is going to hide on the bridge controls, and this leads to the remaining enemies in that little area moving towards Sherpa and being easily dealt with over there. Speaking of easily dealt with, the second Doru soldier is usually dead to Clifford by this point, but he comes into a real streak of missing, and that means that this guy lasts far longer than he has any right to. So that's basically just a bunch of extra animations in the remainder of this video. Meanwhile, my inputs are also going to be slowing down quite a lot at this point. I was absolutely desperate not to flub this attempt that was going so well at this point, and so I started to be really deliberate and considered, especially since I hadn't had much practice on turns this far through, due to turns 6 and 7 being as hideously unreliable as they are. So my apologies for that slowness. The Lance Knight that I killed the horse of is now running away, and I'm basically going to make use of him as a punching bag for Ruby to try and grind her weapon experience up a bit. Faramir uses his bow to chip at the door, and this lowers its HP enough that Clifford is going to be able to break it open on this turn so Reese can start moving in. But I'm going to delay again because there is a pretty scary boss inside there, and I don't want him to come into contact with Reese because I don't want him breaking Gram. That needs to be a last resort. But once again, this demonstrates the utility of Faramir's extra point of infantry movement. I'm also being very careful about the ballista ranges in the lower right because both Ruby and Sylvis are on pretty low HP, and it would be devastating for them if they got hit by a ballista at this point. There are some annoying infantry archers that are sitting outside the fortress and shooting at Clifford and Reese, and they're kind of irritating, but fortunately they don't end up doing much. So Clifford finally breaks down the gate now that the boss has had his turn, and Reese is free to move in finally to the innermost sanctum. This triggers an event that opens the jail door and frees the green units as well. Now, I've mentioned that this map was utterly agonizing to get through, and you may be wondering why I didn't just try dropping a turn or two in order to increase the reliability of the clear. And the answer to that is that I could not find a way to do so. If I had given up Adel's civilian request, I could have sent a unit over in that direction to bait the Lance Knight boss squad downwards instead of to the left, and that would have released some of the pressure on my units. In particular, Volo would have been freed up to do some killing in there. But obviously, once I knew that the Soma was the reward for that, I could not give it up. So that plan was out. And I simply could not figure out any way that cutting just 1 or 2 turns could make the rest of the map more reliable, because every turn that went by was one more turn where Volo could be beaten down by the enemies more than he could handle, and thus break that choke point, or one more turn for Reese to be attacked by random enemies, or one more turn for Sophie to be running around. And really, none of it would have made it any more reliable without sacrificing a substantial number of turns, which I was not willing to do for this run. So instead, I just struggled through until I finally managed to break the map. Now, Clifford is going to provoke the boss, Grove, and this is the first use I have found for the provoke skill in this entire run, so I'm pleased with that. I probably should have switched his weapon away from the Nightsword, because Grove has a special shield that has a 33% chance to reflect damage instead of just blocking it, and so you want to have as few opportunities to attack him as possible. But I didn't think of that, so Clifford ends up using the Nightsword, and it works out alright. At this point, I actually felt that an 8 turn of this map might be within reach, because if the head engineer moved 4 spaces, Reese would be able to talk to him if he went to a specific one. But based on the later parts of this clear, I actually believe the head engineer might only have 3 movements, so that would have been impossible. But that is the reason why I am delaying Reese's movement here, rather than just rushing him forwards to prevent the enemy archer from blocking him off, which does in fact happen in a moment. I also check a ballistician's attack to make sure that Adel will not be killed by him. Fortunately, Adel has enough HP at base to not die there, but once again, I am wanting to make sure that everything is absolutely okay. But because Adel doesn't die to this ballista, he is free to move in and get the house, and so we are going to be getting the Soma because that civilian request is complete. Yay! Now, of course, the archer does move in and block off Reese's movement. He is bound and determined to murder at least one of these green units, and so I, still deluding myself into thinking that 8 turns is possible, have Faramir run in and attempt to kill him with a killer arrow crit. However, that once again does not go well for me, and so I am forced to rely on Reese to kill the archer and unplug the hallway again. Making this attack was probably a mistake because it leaves Faramir very vulnerable, but as you can probably tell, it worked out alright in the end. So the ballista has a crack at Adel now, and thankfully manages to completely miss, which is great for me, because it means I don't need to prioritize moving Adel out of the way on the next turn. And I have to admit that Grom is a really great weapon, and I am extremely grateful that it managed to survive this entire map. I had it equipped mostly as insurance against things going badly against Sophie or the boss, but the fact that I didn't have to waste all its remaining durability on its Miracle Charm effect, at least not in this map, is something that I'm extremely glad of. So at this point the map is now finally under control for the first time in the entire clear, and all I need to do is wait on the green units to finish moving, and the head engineer wanders into a position where Reese is not able to immediately reach him on the next turn, which is extremely annoying because it means that I am going to have to deal with some of turn 9 instead of just finishing the map instantly as soon as I get the chance to move Reese. So as I mentioned, Faramir has been left somewhat vulnerable, and although I am provoking the boss again with Clifford, I was a bit worried still whether that would actually override the possibility of getting a kill on Faramir. So I also took the precaution of moving him further away from the boss into a corner where he is within reach of the archer in the cell fighting the green units. So that was super smart of me, and so it came as a massive relief that the red unit really wants to go exclusively for the green units and didn't bother trying to shoot Faramir, because that would have been a really nasty surprise right at the end of a seriously brutal map. And so all that's left is to stall and stall until the green units finally decide to make their moves. There's nothing particularly scary left. The boss doesn't even get a chance to make his move, but it was very tense for me as I watched. So finally, Davis moves out of the way of the head engineer, and this allows Reese to move in and talk to him. And this completes the chapter in 9 turns. And that is all that I have to say about that.